So thank you for the lovely introduction, and thank you, DIBI for having me. But before I go on with thank yous, I think because all the speakers here have been so inspiring and so informative, and I'm actually here to lecture you. So I'm sorry about that. And so, as Fiona was saying, I'm here to talk about accessibility. And just to give you a bit of context in my background, I studied design and I started working as a designer, and then I moved on to front-end development. And so you'll see a bit of both areas in this presentation, and it's because of that. And so throughout those two different roles that I've played so far, I've had the privilege to work with many different people, many different teams and clients. And so this talk is based on actual conversations that I've had with actual people more than once. And what I'm going to do is tell you about some of the opinions and some misconceptions that I see people having about accessibility, and hopefully if any of you also have those misconceptions, you'll leave here with a different idea of what accessibility is and why it matters and so on. And so this is a very common one, that we don't need to worry that much about accessibility because in fact it only affects or it only benefits a very small range of people. And so I would like to start by asking, and please raise your hand, if you currently have some sort of disability. So a couple of hands, not too much. Okay, and now raise your hand if you're certain that you will have a disability at some point. A few more hands, but also a lot of optimistic people. So let's move forward, and I will start by looking at what a disability is. So according to the dictionary, it's an illness, injury, or condition that makes it difficult for someone to do something that other people can do more easily. And when we can group the disabilities into sort of three groups. The first one is the one that we normally associate when we talk about accessibility, so it's the permanent ones, like blindness or limited mobility, paralysis, and so on. But we also have temporary disabilities that may be caused by an accident, for example, such as a broken arm or a concussion, or even the repetitive strain injuries that are not always as problematic, depends on the days. Or, let's say, there's also situational disabilities, such as when we are using our phones outside in the bright sun, or when we are working from a very loud cafe that makes it hard for us to listen to what's on a video. Or when we are holding our phone with one hand and the baby on the other, it makes it harder for us to use the technology that we are interacting with. And so when you say that there are not that many people with disabilities, well, it's true that when we look at these groups, the group that has less people in it is the group with permanent disabilities. However, there are still around 15% of the world population that have a permanent disability. And this number is very interesting for three reasons. First reason, it means that there are more people with a disability than there are Internet Explorer users. So, if you ever find yourself thinking whether you should give extra effort to supporting legacy browsers or accessibility, I hope this gives you an answer. It's also very interesting because this number is from 2011, I think. But in 1970, the number was actually 10%. So the amount of people with a disability is growing. And it's going to keep growing because of our aging population. So accessibility will start to become more and more relevant over the years. And lastly, this is very interesting because when you care and you do the work for the 15% of people here, it has a positive impact in all of the other examples that I showed you. And this is because accessibility is always a part of usability. And I know some people are worried about compromising usability for accessibility, but I have yet to hear an example in which that actually happens, in which you make something accessible and make it less usable. If you have a valid example, please reach out to me after the talk. I would love to hear it. So the main takeaways that I want you to take from this first part is that anyone can gain a disability and unfortunately very likely will. And also that when you build for accessibility, everybody wins. So if you make sure that a certain app has a good contrast, it's going to be great for people with visual impairments, but it's going to be very good also for people using the phone in the sun. And we'll see other examples of this. So does it only benefit a small range of people? The answer is no. So next, I've heard some people, usually designers, saying that, okay, no, I agree, accessibility is very important, but like the developers are the ones that are building the products. They're the ones that have to make sure that it's accessible. And I'm sure all of you here are more experienced and maybe know that's not true, but I'm just going to run through some examples of why accessibility starts way before the development phase. And so I'm going to talk about design, the role of designers in accessibility. And I'm going to start with the most obvious one, color, and specifically color contrast. And you may think, okay, everyone knows that. We need to ensure that that the text has enough contrast to be read and all that, so why is she telling us this? Well, because while this is the most known issue probably, it's also the one that occurs the most. If you run an accessibility check in most websites, almost all of them fail this one. And so this might happen for a couple of reasons. We may start with a perfect color palette and we know exactly what combinations we can do, but throughout the development of the website, we add like a different color for the shadows that we end up using somewhere else, and then for the inputs and whatnot, and we end up with these 50 shades of gray or whatever color is, and I mean, the movie was bad, why would you do it to your websites? Another example of why color is important. We should avoid, first of all, obviously, the low contrast. There's a lot of this, what you see on the right side, placeholders being used as labels. And in general, it's not good to have text that has such lower contrast indicating important information. But also, if you rely on color alone to say like, oh, there's a link here, there are a lot of people that might miss it. And so there are two ways of fixing this. So using the actual labels for their purpose and using the placeholders only for extra information, and also relying on some sort of shape to indicate that there's some important content or interactive content. And we can do this with many things. So with microcopy or with icons or with patterns or font weights, there are many different ways that we can do this. But ideally, the main takeaway is don't rely on color alone for conveying an important message, such as providing the feedback messages or highlighting important content. So this part, the labeling content and controls, might not always be a job for the designers. If you have a larger team, you might have someone writing the content, but for the sake of simplicity, I have included it here. And why is it important to label content? I'll tell you why. Oh, there should be sound. No sound?
44319fbe.png link.
Okay, let's hear that again.
Link image /K9 MJGTQE1478101344319fbe.png link.
Great experience, huh? So this one is specifically for images. So labeling our content, such as images or icons, it's important for people relying on screen readers so that they know what they are interacting with or what the content is, and so we don't end up with experiences such as this. So in this case, we would want either to say the name of the product or company that's in the logo, or even say it's just home page, something like that. And as far as label goes for controls, well, it's easy. They should focus on the action and not the image, and they should be straight to the point. Because if you're listening to a website instead of seeing it, you don't want to spend 5 seconds in every button. And then we need to design for different types of interactions. So we need to prototype complex or custom interactions early if that's the case, if we're using more complex components. And one of the things that, there's a lot of different assistive technology. I'm going to focus on the keyboard for one reason. It's one of the most widely used. So it's used by people with blindness, with limited mobility, lack of precise muscle control, injuries such as like carpal tunnel, but also it is very used by power users who just prefer this form of navigation. And I think a lot of us here can probably relate to that, so that's why I'm focusing here. This little line of CSS comes from hell, and it is present in a lot of websites. Sometimes people don't even know that they have this on their websites because it comes with the reset CSS files that we just download from somewhere and never look at it just to make our styles consistent. And when I say this comes from hell, it's because taking this, so that, just for context, the outlines are the things that appear around the elements when it's focused, so when we tap through the page. And taking this from people using the keyboard is like taking the cursor from people using the mouse. So it's a recipe for a poor experience. So what can we do? We can not do this at all and just leave it out of our CSS. But if you are super worried about the aesthetics of your website or whatever reason you have, then you should design custom focus states, not just eliminate them completely. So what do we need to design focus states for? Anything that's interactable. Some rules for this. They should stand out, should be very easy to spot where our focus currently is. So it can sort of match your brand, but it should not be like the same as the background. It should be some color that pops up. So make it pop. And then matching the shape and size of the element is also important so that it doesn't end up looking like some notification. And it doesn't have to be the same for all elements, but it should be the same across the same type of element and across browsers. So is it just a job for developers? Obviously not. And now I know there's not a lot of developers in the room, but for those of you that are here, if you think you're off the hook, you're not. So, whoops, spoiler there. I was going to ask, I see that there's been a couple of people offering free stuff here from Aid and Andy, and so now is my time to give you something free. So who here likes free stuff? Anyone? Cool. So here's my free stuff. Know your HTML elements. This piece of advice will give you accessibility for free 90% of the times. Having the elements that convey structure to the page and meaning to interactive elements is different from using divs for everything. And Jeremy already mentioned this in his talk, and I'll dive in a bit more. But essentially, people that are making the browsers, they are incredibly smart, way smarter than I am. You should be listening to them, not to me. And they know what they're doing, and they know how assistive technology works. And when they make the elements in HTML, they make it so that it works for everyone. And if we use them, we have all functionality is going to be widely supported, so it's going to work for free. Another thing that you should worry about when you're building a page is the tab order. So the order in which elements are focused when you tap through the page. And this follows the order of the elements in the HTML. So if you have a logical DOM order, then this will work fine. Elements that are added automatically to the tab order are the interactive ones. So again, for free, they are added to the tab order. Content ones and divs and spans are not added, although there are exceptions, and we can either remove those from the tab order or add these as necessary. A cool tool to check if your tab order is correct is Chrome Lens. It allows you to, if you start trace, it allows you to tab through the page and it draws the line. You should pay attention to lines going off the page because it means that it's focusing hidden content, which is something we don't want, or any irregularities in the order. Also, you might have noticed that go to photos. This is a skip link. It's very easy to implement, and it just allows people to skip right to the content that they want to see instead of having to tab through the menus every time a new page loads. And you can see here, all that you need to do is have a regular HTML link and then hide it by positioning it outside the page. You can't use display none because otherwise it won't be added to the tab order. And then supporting different types of interaction if you're building components from scratch, which I don't usually recommend, because otherwise you'd have to do this. So you need to use this attribute from HTML to add it to the tab order, and then you need to add all the keyboard events. So what happens if you click it with the mouse? What happens if you press the up key or the down key or the space? And then when all this is done, you still have to worry about all the custom labels, so the area labels that Jeremy also mentioned. Another interesting topic for accessibility, and this is useful even if you're not building your custom components, is management, focus management. So when we have a logical tab order, we generally don't have to worry about this until new content pops up on the page. So let's say we have a pop-up or tabs and the content is switching. How do we tell this to the users, like, hey, there's new content, I should take you there? So this would be a bad experience for focus management. You can see we open the menu, we keep tabbing, and you want to tab through the items on the menu, but instead you're tabbing the background because there was no focus management. So what we would need to do, and I won't go into much detail because I know most of you here are not developers, but we need to add a tab index -1, which doesn't add stuff to the DOM order, but allows us to use JavaScript to focus that element. So it would look something like this. So the menu would have the tab index to -1. When we click the button, we focus the menu wrapper. When we close the menu, we focus the button. So we take the user back to the original context before they open the menu. And so now this is what it looks like. The user opens it, it's immediately taken to the menu items, and whenever they tab through them, they stick in the menu instead of like tabbing through content that is actually hidden. And sometimes you have to do a mix of these. So I talked about the different types of interactions for a specific custom element, but sometimes you also have to do focus management in some elements, such as the radio group. If for some reason you don't want to use the default radio group, and usually you will do it, especially because they are fairly easy to style nowadays, even if it's with some hacky stuff. But just as an example, here's what you would need to do if you were building the radio group from scratch. So you need to make sure that the tab keys move in and out of the radio group instead of tabbing through the options. You'd also need to make sure that the arrow keys are the ones that make you go through each option, selecting the next one or the previous one. And finally, you need to make sure that when the user moves to inside the radio group, the option that should be focused is the one that is selected, or the first one if none is selected. Sounds like a lot of work, right? So let's see. We add the tab index to the first option and -1 to the other so that only the first one is in the tab order. And we got the first part done. Not so bad. Then we need to support all the custom interactions. So we need to handle what happens when the user clicks with the mouse on that specific checkbox or label. So we set checked to that checkbox, and I'll go over that function later. But then we also need to make sure that the keyboard is working properly. So if the user presses up, it needs to set the previous checkbox to select it. If they press down, it needs to set the next one. And similar for left, right, space, we need to account for all that. Also, what happens if the user is on the last one and clicks up? Well, we need to redirect them to the first one again. So now it's starting to seem like a bit more work. This would have been easier with CSS. But we got the second part. And now we just need to worry about the last one. So we had this in the first slide where only the first radio group was added to the radio button was added to the tab order. But now, if we keep this, and every time the user taps out and into the radio group, they will be focusing the first one and not the selected. So we need to programmatically make sure that the focus is changed to the next one and the tab index is set to 0 only on the option that is selected. It's not rocket science, but it's a lot of work. I mean, I see that some of you kind of went sleepy over there, imagining having to do this for your work every day. I mean, so main takeaway from that last part is if you can delegate that to the browser makers who are genius and are doing everything, then do, although it is possible to have more control over things. And speaking of control, making it a part of the process is also a very, very useful approach to accessibility. And that's because, and I really like this quote from the Duke University, keeping a website accessible is not easy because websites are living things. We are constantly adding content and features, and new features often break old features, and that happens with accessibility too. So even if you make an effort to have your website accessible at this point, it doesn't mean that in a month from now it will continue to be compliant. And so there's a few things that we can do and a few tools that help us. So browser extensions, they can help us detect some of the most basic issues, but common ones, such as poor color contrast, misspelled or misused area control roles and labels, image alts, some of the stuff that I talked about here. You do have to run them manually, but they will generate reports that might be a great starting point for fixing some of the issues. And this one is Google's Lighthouse. I think it's installed by default on Chrome, so you can just see in the plugins or extensions. And this one is from X. But if possible, automate. And if there are developers here, I'm sure you're a fan of automating stuff. So leaving the repetitive work for someone else to do, preferably code. So there's tools like linters that can also advise you about issues like those browser extensions. They will throw warnings as you're developing, so you can avoid them. You can also write tests, like unit or integration tests for some things. If you're not sure where to start, the keyboard is usually a good one, because like I said, we're familiar with it, and it's one of the most used. So for example, you might want to write a test to make sure that when users click escape, that the modal closes, for example. And you can also use some APIs that test for other assistive technology that you're not as familiar with. And again, like the browsers, these APIs are made by smart people who know how this technology works, and so they'll be able to cover a lot more than we normally would. So, is it just the designer's job? It's not, of course, otherwise I wouldn't be speaking about this. And so this brings us to the last part of the talk, which is the idea that that accessibility and building accessibility into our websites, it's an extra mile. And this was actually the bit that inspired me to learn more about accessibility, because I was maybe in my second year as a full-time worker in design, and came across some very, very interesting blog posts, and I was like, oh, we should do this. This sounds like important stuff, and this was the answer that I got all the time. It's not a priority. Nobody has time for that. We need to deliver. The client is waiting. And this came by, I think, two ideas that accessibility is useless and expensive. And I think we already know that it's not useless from the first myth, so I'll cross that one. But is it expensive? Is it expensive for a business or a company to take time to make their products accessible? No, because products that are accessible don't require extra features or extra content. If they're made accessible from scratch, it shouldn't represent such a tech debt for your team or extra work, unless you want to customize or allow users to customize certain parts of the product, but that's not a hard requirement for your site to be accessible. Also, most challenges are solved by following good practices. So good design practices and good coding practices. So if you're good at your job, you'll probably be making accessible websites already. And also there's a lot of benefits for businesses because websites that are accessible usually perform better in SEO stuff, in being more performant generally, because they follow good practices, they are easier to maintain. And so actually, I say it's more expensive to ignore accessibility than it is to tackle it. And if you are really, really stubborn and you're still wondering why you should care, well, I think it's our duty. And we've talked about it so many times this past 2 days, how the web is so powerful and so enabling, and we see businesses being born every day that are running exclusively online, or with lockdown, we see businesses that have had to move their businesses online and that survived because of that. And also, people had to rely on technology to do many things because certainly they couldn't do them in any other place because they couldn't leave their homes. And I think we are building a wonderful world where we can navigate and learn and talk to people and do all sorts of things from our phones. And we are privileged to be the ones building that. So I think with our privilege, there's also a responsibility to make sure that we include everyone in this world that we're building. So I don't think it's an extra mile. I think it's part of the job. And so now you're probably already convinced, like, yay, I'm going to tackle accessibility in all my projects, but how do I start? Well, I'll give you some hints. So first of all, learn. Be curious to learn more. It's really not as scary as it may seem. If you take a few hours here and there to just read some resources, you'll learn the most important stuff real quick. And if there are any project managers in the room or managers, you should make sure that people in your teams have time to learn this while they are working. It shouldn't be an extra. And I can share with you some resources. This might look really heavy, but the Y area authoring practices actually has a lot of useful and accessible information, such as like if I'm building a custom component, what are all the keyboard and whatever behaviors that I need to support. There's a lot of free resources out there that you can use for learning accessibility. Start early. If you are starting a new project, then this is the perfect time to start. If you do it from the start, it's going to be very easy. It's going to be part of the principles of the application, and it won't be a concern later. It won't become technical debt. There's a few resources also that will help you. This one, I find this one interesting because it has different checklists for different roles that you should be worrying about, so you can sort of have a reference to follow on this project. Identify if you already have a product that's live or a website that is live, then you're not starting from the beginning, but what you should do is identifying key user journeys and then starting on those. So, for example, if you have an e-commerce website, It's probably more important that the user can add items to the shopping cart and then go through the checkout than it is for them to be able to add things to the wish list. So I would start with those. And also, very important, communicating with your team and community, being an advocate. And this can look like many, many things. It doesn't have to be coming to a stage to talk about accessibility. It might just mean that when you are code reviewing and you notice something is missing something to make it accessible, you leave a comment, or when you notice that someone made an effort towards accessibility, then you also leave a comment cheering for that effort. It might mean that you push back on design feedback meetings when you notice that there's something that's not fully accessible yet, and you give that feedback. And it also means if you're working on a design system that you make sure that accessibility is incorporated in the design system so that other teams will have that accessibility for free. And finally, if possible, test it with actual people, including people with real disabilities. And there are platforms now that help you find these users so that you can do usability tests with people that use assistive technology. So it's becoming increasingly easier to make these tests. So there's a lot of resources out there. I hope I didn't scare you off accessibility. And if you have any questions or comments or would like to know a bit more about the process for how to convince my team to work on this, feel free to reach out to me. And thank you for listening to me through this talk.
Thank you.